This is TWiT.
Let's talk about China. Something pleasant. Something. Oh my God! So China's been on our minds all week because of various contretemps with China and American companies. But let's set the stage with this story from the Washington Post. This is a Chinese app that is basic. It's not required, but if you're in the Chinese Communist Party, you must have it. It's on 100 million Android cell phones in China. It is also on iOS phones. It is many workplaces in China require you have it. The app is, well, on the face of it, not a bad thing. It's an educational app that teaches Chinese people about their country. Its name, translated in English, is Study the Great Nation. And it contains news articles and videos, many of them about President Xi, the president for life at China. There's also a sense of competition. Users earn points for reading articles and commenting on them. There's a leaderboard. The Post reports at least one worker in China who has to read the articles and take the quizzes and get 2,000 points or she'll be fired. So, it's kind of, semi-required in China. Interestingly, though, the Open Technology Fund, which is an initiative funded by our government under Radio Free Asia, took the Android version of the app and submitted it to a security analyst, Cure53, a German cybersecurity firm, to determine what the app can do. Now, this is the Android version. It's not clear what the iPhone version would be capable of, but in the case of the Android version, once the app is installed, it basically gives the Chinese government super user surveillance on the app, the ability to turn on the camera or microphone, to record, to see every message, to have access to more than 960 apps, including shopping, travel, messaging platforms. It can access photos and videos, transmit the user's location, dial phone numbers, go through contacts and internet activity. It even can turn on the Wi-Fi and the flashlight. It is basically an all-powerful app, basically required by the Chinese government, installed on 100 million phones. That's the Android version. They did not analyze the Apple version, and it's possible that Apple has more restrictions on what apps can do, but it's possible not, as we know from the 0 day that was being used by the Chinese government to monitor Uyghurs. So here's a really good example of what we don't, thank God, have yet in this country, but a government app that surveils its citizenry 100%. And I've been thinking a little bit about this because what has happened more and more in the last few, maybe years, maybe months, is this little pocket pal of ours that is so incredibly useful and it does so many things for us, has somewhat become the enemy in our pocket. Yep. Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp use it to surveil us. Apps vie to put more notifications on our screen because they're essentially advertisements for the app. The phone seems to have a life of its own, and more I hear from users. I heard from an 86-year-old woman today on the radio show who said, Apple hasn't been able to help me turn off all the pop-ups on my iPhone. And I think she was talking about notifications. I helped her a little bit to turn those off, but she was incredibly irritated about this. It is the ultimate surveillance device. And one of the reasons law enforcement has these tools from Celebrite, and we know the New York Police Department has it, that can unlock all the data on this phone, is because it is incredibly valuable. Is this smartphone our enemy or our friend? And should we be more concerned about it? I hear you, Brianna, nodding.
I couldn't agree more. This is terrifying. Orwellian is not a strong enough statement for this.
This is straight out of 1984, where the Winston Smith's Visa screen was looking at him as much as he was looking at it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Only this is infinitely more powerful, the smartphone.
And I do think it's worth noting, I don't think this would fly in America. I think if our government tried to do this, we would definitely push back. There would be lawsuits about it.
Although, in a way, if the New York City Police Department has Celebrite in the station and you get arrested, not convicted, but arrested, they take your phone. If you try to get in the country, they can take your phone and suck everything out of it. How different is that? I'm not sure it is.
It's not. And this is why we need very strong privacy protections. We need a privacy bill of rights that's written with 2019 standards to look at the issues we weren't facing in 1990, but we're facing today. That is incredibly important. And it's very clear, these status quo politicians, they don't understand this stuff. They don't care about it. So I think it's really imperative that you vote for candidates that will, actively voice their support for privacy.
I completely agree with all of this. And that is essential that we get people in office in, the US and the EU and everywhere who understand the importance of all of these things. That being said, comparing what's happening in China with, what could happen somewhere else, which everything could happen everywhere, is a little bit alarmist because China has, I feel like, this week or these past few weeks, for a number of reasons, a few things happened, have kind of made us realize, first of all, how totalitarian China has become. I don't know if that's a fair way of saying it, but for a couple of decades or a few more, we were thinking, well, economic growth will make things better. And since Xi Jinping has come into power, I feel like maybe it's just that we see it because tech has been involved more, but the state has become more and more restrictive and like full on totalitarian. So I don't know. It's the core issue, and the tech is being used for this, but the core issue is the nature of that state. And what's new now, and I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but it's so important, and we are so embedded economically and technologically with China that its values and its demands are bleeding into our realm. It's not so separated anymore. But if you're talking about tech only and the way they're using it, the Stasi was spying on everyone in East Germany already.
Just imagine what the Stasi could have done with a smartphone.
Yeah.
Well, what China is doing now, that's what they would have done.
So in a way,
China is doing it.
It's the nexus of, China was going through a liberalism in the 80s that led to Tiananmen Square protests and a crackdown in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And that's why there was some hope that China might be, the whole idea, I think, was, well, China, as, they're digging their way basically out of feudalism, but as they do so and become more prosperous, there will be increased liberalism. And I do say that with it's not liberals, it's liberalism, it's Western liberalism in China, the idea of freedom and so forth. That seems to not be the case any longer. It also seems to be changing in Russia. And then that is the big issue, because this was the week the NBA kowtowed to China.
Oh.
This was the week that Blizzard, your former employer, Patrick, kowtowed to China. This was the week that Google kowtowed to China, pulling an app that was a game around the Hong Kong protests. And the one that seems to me most concerning is Apple, which has first removed, then put back after a lot of protest, and then removed the app that helps Hong Kong protesters track the police. And then Tim Cook, who is, a champion of freedom, at least in his rhetoric, writes a memo to Apple employees saying we had to pull it because it was being used to target police, parroting the, I believe, incorrect assertions of the Chinese government.
Yeah.
And so my concern, we had a big debate over this on Friday on This Week in Google. My concern is that American companies, instead of championing the freedoms that let them succeed economically, are giving an undue influence to the Chinese government because of its great economic value to them.
Yeah, Leo, I mean, it's worth saying these are the exact same tech companies that tell us we have to accept hate speech. We have to accept, extreme harassment, the kind of which I've received. And then they turn around and say, oh, unless it's a very powerful government asking for this thing, and then it's fine. It seems very hypocritical to me. I've been
Is
it
because it's a powerful government, or is it because it's a market of 1.5 billion people?
I think it's both of those things.
That's more reprehensible to me, because it's bowing to the dollar, not to, politics or ideology or fear. It's bowing to greed.
Well, I think, there are others that can speak to this, but I think it's worth noting that Tencent has taken huge equity stakes in many American game companies. I've spent a career specializing in Unreal Engine. Tencent owns a huge venture capital stake in that. They own a huge stake in Blizzard. They own a huge stake in a lot of American game companies. And, this is a price that we are paying when we are allowing this foreign investment into American tech companies. So I do think that's something we should have a much more honest conversation about.
Nate?
And it's interesting.
Okay, go ahead,
sorry.
Patrick. I just want to get Nate in the conversation. He's wisely staying out of it. And I'm not going to let you cruise yourself here.
When people are saying smart things that I agree with, I tend to stay quiet, because it's easier to not put your foot in your mouth when other people are doing the smart talking for you. But I do have a couple of thoughts that sprung to mind. The first is that this is always an opportunity to vote with our wallets.
Yeah.
We have a choice whether we buy a certain company's product or not. Most of us do anyway, and that is something that we can consciously choose to change if we want in the future based on what a company does. The other thing that I thought is just worth mentioning kind of goes back to the surveillance app that we talked about a few minutes ago, because we have this issue in the UK at the moment where our government wants backdoors being added into end-to-end encrypted messaging, which on a technical level raises a whole load of questions as to how exactly do you put a backdoor in something that's encrypted end-to-end. But the whole reason is to try and target terrorism and very serious crime. And what always happens is we just see the people who are actually doing that just use a different product or a different piece of software. And so my question would be, with the Chinese app that we were talking about, whether the people that the government most wants to track are actually the ones who are not going to be using Android, or they're going to use a heavily, they've got a different ROM, they flashed the whole thing, they're not using that app. And actually it is the average person in the street who, once again, tends to bear the brunt of the surveillance, when the people who are most, the biggest threat to whatever institution are, they're off using a different product.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? This is the case with a lot of these kinds of. I think about copy protection, which never stopped pirates. It only stopped
but
normal
I think
people.
In the case of China and that app, it's not targeting specific people. I don't think it's just blanketing as much of it as possible, which is just an illustration of how totalitarian China. Right. I want to say is turning, but
the difference is, Patrick, China doesn't have to justify it by saying, "Well, we're going to find child pornography guys or terrorists." We have to do that in the United States when we want to do mass surveillance. We have to make up a pretext and say, "Well, think of the children." But in China, they just say everybody has to have this app.
And it's a very different culture.
No, it's even worse. It's.
Go ahead. First, I want to hear finish your thought, Patrick, and then I want to talk to Nate, because I think this is an interesting point.
I was going to take it into a slightly different direction. So maybe Nate first.
Yeah.
And then
So
I'll
Nate
because I think
raises the cultural argument, and this is an interesting argument that's often made by people who say, but you have to understand, China and the Chinese people, they want this kind of security and safety.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a bottom line that culturally, certainly in Western Europe, certainly you guys in the US, we grow up with a very different view on privacy and personal freedoms, freedoms of speech and what have you. In China, my understanding, and I don't want to step out of line by pretending I know more about this than I actually do, but I do understand that the sort of that inherent feeling of privacy is just very, very different.
Yeah.
And what we as onlookers from outside looking in, we think this is terrible. This would never fly here. And I think those comments are absolutely correct. It wouldn't, but they're not flying here. They're flying in China, where people just have a different expectation. And, we can decide between ourselves whether we think it's right or wrong. But fundamentally, that's probably not going to change in even the near or medium term future.
I also want to, in that regard, point to Maciej Ceglowski, who is the creator of Pinboard and has been in Hong Kong for some time, kind of as an observer, almost an embedded journalist in Hong Kong. And on his Pinboard Twitter account, he kind of addresses this notion that, the Chinese people don't mind this surveillance use video of police chasing and beating a young woman in China. He says, no, there are people in China. The fact that these protests are occurring in Hong Kong show you that Chinese people want freedom, want liberty just as much as people in the West. That it's kind of a disservice to say to the Chinese people, oh, yeah, you guys like this. This is, since Confucianism, you've embraced this. It's okay for the Chinese government to do this because that's what the Chinese people want. Now, and I agree with you, Nate. I know we're kind of culturally tone deaf. We're speaking as Americans, not as Chinese citizens, and I get a lot of email from people who live in China saying, "Oh, you just don't understand it." So I know that there's controversy over this, but I have to say, Maciej, who is there and by the way, doing an amazing job reporting. Here's he says an example of why this app that's been banned by Apple, HK Map Live, is so vital. Can you tell me what color this police flag is? If it's black, people need to put on a tear gas mask. If it's blue and you're wearing the mask, you go to jail for a year. You need to know what color the flag is, that flag right here, because that tells you what's going on, and HK Map would tell you that, and that's why it's vital that HK Map exists. It is not being used, as Tim Cook said, to target police or to go to areas where there are no police to steal. It's not that at all, and Tim Cook misstated how, according to Maciej, how important HK Map is to the citizens of Hong Kong who are using it to stay safe.
I think that's why, Tim Cook's statement on this, it really rang as hollow and hypocritical and, really not standing up to the Chinese government. It seems like a very valid use case, as you've said. And, Leo, I've said this on my show to you before, but I married into a Chinese family that immigrated here from China. And it definitely has changed my perspective on a lot of things. For instance, if you were to say this to my father-in-law, I know the first thing he would say is, well, look at how many more people the United States has in prison compared to China.
That's
if you're
a good
worried
point.
about privacy.
And most of the people of color. Good point.
That would be the first thing he would say to you. I do think at the same time, this is a gut check time. This is where you show your morals. This is where you show what you're made of. I think what was so distressing about Apple, a company that I use and other people use because of their strong stance on privacy and encryption.
Yeah, we expected more of Apple, I guess.
They've spent billions building up this brand around that, Leo, and for them to just turn around and, side with the Chinese government for what really feels like false pretext, it just makes me feel gross about using their stuff. There is a wider conversation we need to have here in America about our surveillance state. It's true the government is not involved in this, but I think if I sat down with a lot of people that watch TWiT and I showed them, okay, this is the information I have as a political candidate that I can use to micro-target viewers. And when you start thinking about the amount of commercial corporate information out there that you can use, it's virtually unlimited. It's virtually unregulated. There's no rules about what you can say or fact checking, as we saw this week.
Yes, we could talk about that too.
Yeah, there's I would argue, in my opinion, that the surveillance state exists in both societies. It's just more corporately focused in ours.